Alicia Brown chooses silence for peace. For years, she endured the pressure, blame, and silent discrimination at a powerful American corporation, choosing peace over conflict. But when the company needed someone to take responsibility, her silence was exploited. Evidence was distorted. Colleagues turned a blind eye. In a trial already tipped toward conviction, Alicia stood alone, judged before she could utter a word. They thought she would still choose silence, but they were wrong. What would you do to fight workplace injustice? Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from today? And if you believe that injustice shouldn't exist anywhere, then this story is for you. Newark, New Jersey. A gray morning settled over the city like a held breath. Low clouds pressed down on brick buildings and narrow streets, and a thin winter drizzle streaked the sidewalks. Commuter trains groaned in the distance, carrying people who believed, or needed to believe, that showing up quietly was enough to survive another day. Alicia Brown believed that too. She was 32, tall and slender, with a posture shaped by years of standing straight even when she wanted to disappear. Her skin was a deep, even brown, her face narrow with high cheekbones and a seriousness that rarely softened in public. Alicia wore her long black hair pulled back into a low, practical tie. No loose strands, no distractions. At work, she dressed in neutral colors, gray blouses, black slacks, flat shoes. Nothing that could be called careless, nothing that could be called bold. People often described her as calm. What they didn't see was how carefully that calm had been built. Alicia worked in quality control at North River Logistics, a massive transportation company whose warehouses lined the industrial edges of Newark. The building itself was a concrete giant, windowless in places, humming constantly with conveyor belts, forklifts, and the echo of metal on metal. Inside, fluorescent lights erased any sense of time. Day and night felt the same. From her first year there, Alicia noticed the pattern. She was assigned the most complicated inspections, the ones no one else wanted. Her reports were reviewed twice, sometimes 3 times, while others passed with a glance. In meetings, her suggestions were acknowledged with nods but rarely written down, until a white colleague repeated them minutes later. She told herself it was coincidence. Then, experience told her it wasn't. Alicia's silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. At home, silence meant peace. She lived in a modest apartment with her mother, Sarah Brown, a woman in her early 60s whose body carried the quiet cost of a lifetime of factory work. Sarah was medium height, slightly stooped, with strong hands and a face lined by time and worry. Her hair, once jet black, was now threaded with gray, worn short and natural. She moved slowly due to chronic back pain from years on an assembly line, but her eyes remained sharp and observant. Sarah had raised Alicia alone after her husband died in a warehouse accident when Alicia was 10. That loss shaped Sarah's temperament, gentle with her children, wary of authority, and deeply afraid of instability. She believed in keeping one's head down, paying bills on time, and never giving an employer a reason to look your way. "Jobs don't love you back," she used to say, "so don't make them angry." Alicia learned early that conflict came with a price. Their small apartment smelled of brewed coffee and lavender cleaner in the mornings. A framed photo of Alicia's father sat on the kitchen shelf, untouched but never forgotten. On the windowsill slept Milo, a gray and white cat with cloudy green eyes and a torn ear, an elderly rescue, slow to trust but fiercely loyal once he did. Milo followed Alicia from room to room, a quiet shadow as if he understood her preference for wordless company. Alicia also helped support her younger brother, Marcus Brown, 21, tall and broad-shouldered with an easy smile that masked constant anxiety about tuition and rent. Marcus studied engineering at a state university and worked nights to cover what scholarships didn't. Alicia never complained about sending money. She saw it as a duty, one more reason to endure. That was why, when her direct supervisor Daniel Whitmore raised his voice at her on the warehouse floor, Alicia lowered her eyes instead of answering back. Daniel Whitmore was 45, solidly built, with close-cropped light brown hair and a face that rarely revealed emotion beyond irritation. He dressed sharply for a warehouse manager, pressed button-down shirts, polished shoes, making sure everyone noticed the difference between him and the people he oversaw. He spoke with authority that came not from knowledge, but from confidence, and he had a habit of correcting Alicia publicly. "Brown, this report's incomplete," he barked one afternoon, holding her clipboard like evidence. "Do it again, and do it right this time." Alicia knew it wasn't incomplete. She had checked it twice. Around them, co-workers avoided eye contact. Some were younger, some older, but most shared the same instinct. Don't get involved. Alicia felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, the urge to defend herself. Instead, she nodded. "Yes, sir?" Daniel smirked slightly, not satisfied, but reassured. To him, silence confirmed control. At lunch, Alicia sat alone near the loading dock, eating quietly while watching trucks back into place. She had learned not to join conversations that stopped when she approached. It wasn't that her co-workers disliked her. They simply didn't want to be associated with someone who attracted scrutiny. One of them, Lena Ortiz, a Latina woman in her late 20s with kind eyes and a nervous laugh, sometimes sat nearby. Lena was friendly but cautious, the type who apologized too often and kept her opinions small. "They ride you hard," Lena once whispered. "I see it." Alicia smiled faintly. "It's fine." It wasn't, but saying otherwise wouldn't change anything. Years earlier, Alicia had tried speaking up. Once, she had reported a safety oversight she believed was being ignored. The response was swift and cold. Her work was audited for weeks. Her schedule changed without explanation. Her performance re-evaluated. The message had been clear. After that, Alicia chose silence not because she believed in it, but because she feared what speaking cost. By the time she returned home each evening, the city lights were already flickering on. Newark looked different at night, less harsh, more forgiving. Alicia liked walking the last block slowly, letting the cold air quiet her thoughts. Inside, Sarah would ask gently, "Long day?" Alicia always answered the same way. "Just tired." She never told her mother about Daniel, or the meetings where her name was skipped, or the way her reports came back marked in red ink while others didn't. She believed she was protecting her family. What Alicia didn't know, what no one told her, was that her silence had been noticed. Not as dignity, not as professionalism, but as opportunity. Somewhere within the upper layers of North River logistics, decisions were being made, numbers reviewed, mistakes buried, and when the time came to assign blame, they would need someone who wouldn't fight back. Alicia Brown, the quiet one, seemed perfect. That evening, rain tapped softly against the apartment window as Alicia set her bag down and leaned against the door. Milo lifted his head, blinking slowly. Sarah hummed from the kitchen, stirring soup. Alicia closed her eyes and exhaled. She told herself what she always did. Silence will pass. Silence keeps things steady. But outside, thunder rolled low and distant, unheard over the hum of the city. And in that soundless space between endurance and surrender, something irreversible had already begun. Monday morning arrived sharp and unforgiving. The rain had stopped, leaving Newark washed in a pale, metallic light that reflected off puddles in the parking lot of North River Logistics. Alicia Brown, parked farther than usual, sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel and took a steady breath. She didn't know yet that this was the last time she would enter the building as an employee. Inside, the warehouse hummed with its usual mechanical rhythm. Conveyor belts rattled, forklifts beeped in reverse, and voices echoed off concrete walls. Alicia scanned her badge at the security gate and felt the familiar click of acceptance. She nodded to the guard, who barely looked up. Everything appeared normal, and that made the sudden call feel all the more wrong. Alicia Brown. A voice crackled over the intercom, flat and formal. Please report to Human Resources. Human Resources was on the second floor, away from the noise, behind a glass door that always felt colder than the rest of the building. Alicia's steps slowed as she climbed the stairs. She noticed the way conversations paused when people saw where she was headed. No one asked why. No one followed. Inside the HR office sat Karen Doyle, the senior HR manager. Karen was a white woman in her early 50s, short and meticulously groomed, with sharp bangs and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified her eyes just enough to feel invasive. She spoke softly, but never warmly, and she carried herself with the practiced neutrality of someone who believed rules were more important than people. Beside Karen sat Mark Ellison, a corporate compliance officer flown in from headquarters. Mark was tall, thin, and precise, with silver hair combed straight back and a face that showed no curiosity, only procedure. He didn't introduce himself. He simply nodded once, as if Alicia were already late. Daniel Whitmore stood behind them, leaning casually against the wall. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, almost bored. He looked like a man watching a process complete itself. Karen gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit, Alicia." Alicia sat, placing her hands neatly in her lap. She noticed a manila folder on the desk, thick and already labeled with her name. Karen didn't waste time. "This meeting concerns a serious violation of company safety protocol." Alicia's brow tightened. "I'm not aware of—" Karen raised a hand gently. "We've completed a preliminary review." The word preliminary sounded final. Mark slid a tablet across the desk. On the screen was security footage from the warehouse floor, grainy, angled from above. Alicia leaned forward. She saw a figure at a workstation, time-stamped during her shift. A digital signature appeared on a scanned approval form. Her name, her employee ID. Karen spoke again. "This footage shows you authorizing a shipment that failed inspection. The resulting loss was substantial." Alicia's heartbeat grew loud in her ears. "That isn't possible," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I didn't approve that shipment, I flagged it." Daniel shifted slightly, uncrossing and recrossing his arms. "We all saw you working that station," he said calmly. "You were responsible." Alicia turned to him. "I was covering inspections, not approvals. You reassigned—" Mark interrupted. "We've also spoken with several employees." Karen nodded. They couldn't clearly recall the details, but none disputed that you were involved. The words "couldn't recall" landed like a verdict disguised as uncertainty. Alicia felt heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. "May I see the full footage?" she asked. "The surrounding time?" Karen's lips pressed together. "What you see here is sufficient." Alicia looked again at the screen. The angle felt wrong. The timing too clean. "This doesn't show the whole process," she said quietly. "There should be another camera." Mark shut off the tablet. "The investigation is complete." Karen opened the folder and slid a document forward. "Effective immediately, your employment with North River Logistics is terminated for gross negligence." The word terminated echoed. Alicia stared at the paper. No warning, no suspension, no review panel. "I need to appeal this," she said. "At least give me a chance to—" Karen shook her head. "Your badge will be deactivated by the time you leave this room." Daniel finally met Alicia's eyes. His gaze was steady, almost sympathetic. "I'm sorry it had to end this way," he said, his tone rehearsed. Alicia stood slowly. Her legs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. She gathered her bag, looked once more at the folder on the desk, then turned and walked out. The hallway felt longer on the way back. When she reached the warehouse floor, people avoided her eyes. Lena Ortiz stood near a pallet rack, her hands frozen mid-motion. Their eyes met for a brief second. Lena's face held fear, not surprise. She looked away first. At the security gate, Alicia scanned her badge. Red light. A guard stepped forward, apologetic but firm, and escorted her to the exit. She didn't argue. Outside, the air felt thinner. In the parking lot, Alicia sat in her car and finally let her hands shake. Not from anger, from disbelief. She replayed the footage in her mind, the signatures, the voices that suddenly couldn't remember. Silence pressed in, heavier than it ever had before. At the same time, 3 floors above the server room, Rachel Miller stared at her computer screen, heart pounding. Rachel was 26, pale-skinned with soft freckles and light brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail that never quite stayed in place. She wore oversized sweaters and avoided attention whenever possible. As a junior IT systems analyst, she spent her days monitoring data integrity, backups, and security logs, work that made her invisible until something went wrong. That morning, something had. An automated alert flagged a discrepancy in archived camera footage timestamps. Rachel frowned and pulled the file. The metadata didn't align. A clip had been trimmed, overwritten. The access log showed a manual edit during Daniel Whitmore's authorized window. Rachel swallowed hard. She opened another file, the approval documents. The digital signature scan had been inserted after the timestamp of the alleged inspection. That wasn't standard. That wasn't accidental. Rachel's stomach tightened. She knew what this meant. She also knew who Daniel Whitmore was. Everyone did. He was protected, connected. Complaints about him disappeared. Rachel thought of her probationary status, her student loans, her rent. She minimized the window and stared at her reflection in the darkened monitor. If I say nothing, nothing happens, she told herself. But the image of the woman she'd seen in the hallway earlier that morning, the tall black employee with the composed face walking toward HR, wouldn't leave her mind. Back at Alicia's apartment, Sarah Brown was folding laundry when the door opened earlier than usual. She looked up, concern forming instantly. "You're home," she said. "What happened?" Alicia set her bag down slowly. Milo lifted his head and patted over, brushing against her leg. Alicia knelt and buried her fingers in his fur, steadying herself. "They fired me," she said. Sarah froze. The towel slipped from her hands. Years of quiet endurance showed on her face, followed by something sharper, fear mixed with anger. "For what?" Alicia shook her head. "For something I didn't do." Sarah pulled her into a careful embrace, mindful of her back but firm in her resolve. She had seen this before. Not the specifics, but the pattern, the way silence was used against people like them. That night, Newark glowed beyond the window, indifferent and bright. Alicia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing every hum of the city. She realized something had shifted. Silence had not protected her. It had only delayed the impact. And somewhere in a server room filled with quiet machines, a young woman stared at the truth and wondered how much courage it would cost to let it speak. The decision to sue North River Logistics did not come with relief. It came with sleepless nights, stacks of paperwork, and the quiet judgment of people who thought Alicia Brown was being reckless. Lawsuits, especially against powerful corporations, were not seen as acts of courage. They were seen as gambles, ones people like her were expected to lose. The Superior Court of New Jersey rose from the center of Newark like a monument to authority. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was pale and brittle, the air cold enough to sting. Alicia stood on the courthouse steps, her coat buttoned tight, her shoulders squared. She looked composed, but inside, every instinct told her she was walking into a room designed to remind her where she stood. Beside her was her attorney, Thomas Green, a public defender turned civil rights lawyer in his late 30s. He was thin, slightly hunched, with tired eyes behind rectangular glasses and a suit that had seen better days. Thomas spoke softly, but his mind was sharp. Shaped by years of representing clients no one expected to win. He believed in preparation, not theatrics, and he had warned Alicia from the beginning. The courtroom would not be fair. It would only pretend to be. Across the aisle sat North River's legal team. Their lead attorney, Richard Hale, was a man in his early 50s with silver hair and a controlled smile that never reached his eyes. He wore tailored suits and spoke with practiced confidence, the kind built on knowing the system favored him. To him, Alicia was not a person. She was a risk to be contained. Judge Harold Whitman presided over the case. He was in his 60s, tall and broad, with a heavy-set frame and thinning gray hair. His expression was permanently stern, his patience thin. He valued efficiency over empathy and had little tolerance for what he considered emotional appeals. From the moment the proceedings began, Alicia felt the weight shift against her. Richard Hale opened with calm authority, framing the case not as discrimination but as accountability. He spoke of documented performance issues, of previous reminders, of a pattern of negligence. Each phrase landed like a stone. Alicia sat still, hands folded, feeling her past silence being rewritten as evidence of incompetence. Thomas objected, pointing out the lack of formal warnings in her employment record. Judge Whitman waved him off. "The jury can decide how much weight to give that," he said, already turning back to Hale. The first witness was a former co-worker, Brian Keller, a warehouse supervisor in his 40s with a thick neck and restless eyes. He avoided looking at Alicia as he testified. When asked if he remembered who approved the faulty shipment, he shrugged. "I don't recall clearly. It could have been her." Another witness followed. Janice Moore, a middle-aged clerk with tight lips and a stiff posture, claimed she assumed Alicia was responsible because she often worked late. Her words were careful, vague enough to avoid lying outright, sharp enough to wound. One by one, they did the same thing. No one directly accused her. No one defended her either. Their collective uncertainty painted her as the most convenient answer. When Alicia took the stand, the room felt colder. Richard Hale approached slowly, his voice measured. "Ms. Brown," he said, "isn't it true you've been spoken to before about errors in your reports?" Alicia inhaled. "I've had my work reviewed more often than others," she replied. "But I was never formally disciplined." Hale tilted his head. "So you admit your work required extra oversight?" Before Alicia could answer, Judge Whitman interrupted. "Just answer the question, Ms. Brown." She did, and each answer seemed to shrink in the space between them. Hale suggested she lacked the qualifications to handle complex inspections. He implied her lawsuit was motivated by bitterness, not justice. He questioned why she hadn't spoken up earlier if conditions were truly unfair. Alicia felt the room lean away from her. The jury watched closely, some faces skeptical, others unreadable. She searched for understanding and found distance instead. When Thomas tried to redirect, emphasizing the missing footage and altered documents, Hale objected repeatedly. The judge sustained most of them. Time slipped away. Alicia's voice remained steady, but doubt crept in quietly. If I had spoken earlier, if I had challenged them before, would this be different? She wondered if her silence had trained everyone, including herself, to believe she was someone blame-fit easily. During a recess, Alicia sat alone on a wooden bench in the hallway. Her mother, Sarah, was not there. The courtroom had been too much for her fragile back and anxious heart. Instead, Alicia felt her absence like an ache. Milo's imagined weight at her feet offered no comfort here. Inside the courtroom, Richard Hale reviewed his notes with confidence. To him, the case was unfolding exactly as planned. By the end of the day, Alicia returned to her seat as Judge Whitman dismissed the court. His final glance in her direction was sharp, impatient, as though her presence itself were an inconvenience. As the room emptied, Alicia remained seated for a moment longer. She felt smaller than she had in years, not because she lacked truth, but because truth seemed unwelcome here. The courtroom that was meant to deliver justice had instead mirrored the world she had endured in silence, one where assumptions spoke louder than facts, and power decided what was remembered. She stood slowly, gathering her coat, aware now of something she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. Silence had not only failed to protect her, it had taught them how to erase her. Sleep became a stranger to Rachel Miller. Night after night she lay awake in her small apartment, the glow of her laptop casting pale light across unwashed mugs and scattered notes. At 26, Rachel had the careful look of someone who learned early not to take up too much space. Slight frame, soft freckles across a narrow face, light brown hair usually pulled into a loose ponytail that slipped free when she forgot herself. She dressed for comfort, not attention, and spoke with an apologetic cadence as if every sentence asked permission to exist. Fear had shaped her, not suddenly but patiently. By day, Rachel worked in the IT division at North River Logistics, a junior systems analyst responsible for data integrity and security logs. She was good at her job, methodical, precise, and deeply uncomfortable with confrontation. She liked machines because they did not judge. Data did not smirk or raise its voice. Data simply told the truth if you knew how to listen. And the data had been screaming. It started as a routine anomaly, an automated alert flagging a mismatch between archived footage timestamps and access logs. Rachel had seen minor discrepancies before, usually harmless glitches. This one wasn't. The edit trail was too clean, too deliberate. She reopened the files, zooming in on the metadata, her fingers steady while her chest tightened. One camera angle from the warehouse floor had been trimmed by exactly 46 seconds. The cut wasn't random. It removed the moment when approvals changed hands. The edit time aligned precisely with a management override window, Daniel Whitmore's credentials. The name alone made Rachel's stomach turn. Daniel Whitmore had a presence that filled rooms. Middle-aged, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, with an authority that came from knowing who protected him, he moved through the company like someone who never expected consequences. Rachel had never spoken to him directly, but she had seen how people straightened when he passed, how complaints evaporated before reaching him. She checked another file, the approval document. Alicia Brown's signature was there, clean, crisp, undeniable, except it wasn't native to the document. The scan had been embedded after the timestamp. Copied. Pasted. Rachel stared at the screen until the lines blurred. This wasn't negligence, it was construction. Rachel closed her laptop and pressed her palms into her eyes. If she stayed quiet, nothing would happen. The system would keep running. Her paycheck would arrive on time. Her probation period would end quietly. Silence would keep her safe. She thought of Alicia. Rachel remembered the night the warehouse system crashed last year. She had been new then, hands shaking as error messages multiplied. Panic had crept up her throat. It was Alicia who stayed late, who didn't ask why a junior IT analyst was crying in a supply closet, who calmly rerouted processes and told Rachel where to look. Alicia hadn't reported her mistake. She hadn't taken credit either. She had simply said, "You're okay. We'll fix it." That memory refused to fade. Back at the courthouse, Alicia's world felt suspended between breaths. The trial continued without her knowing what Rachel had discovered. Each day left her more drained, more aware of how easily narratives replaced facts. She returned home exhausted, greeted by Milo's slow, deliberate steps and her mother's watchful eyes. Sarah Brown had always been a woman of restraint. In her early 60s, she was slender but worn, her movements careful due to a back injury that never truly healed. Years of factory shifts had taught her endurance and caution in equal measure. She spoke kindly to neighbors, avoided arguments, and carried a deep mistrust of systems that promised fairness, but delivered survival at best. Watching her daughter prepare for court each morning, Sarah felt a familiar dread. She recognized this pattern too well, the way institutions closed ranks, the way quiet people were expected to accept outcomes without protest. It reminded her of her husband's death, the unanswered questions, the reports that never quite made sense. "You don't have to carry this alone," Sarah said one evening, her voice gentle but firm. Alicia managed a small smile. "I know." But knowing and believing were not the same. Meanwhile, Rachel's fear deepened. At work, she flinched whenever footsteps passed her cubicle. She imagined someone standing behind her, reading her screen. She stopped bringing her lunch, stopped checking her phone. Every instinct told her to erase the files, to forget what she'd seen. Instead, she copied them. She encrypted the data and saved it to a private drive, hands trembling as she labeled the folder. Proof didn't feel like power. It felt like weight. The call came late one afternoon from a number she didn't recognize. Rachel let it ring once, twice, before answering. "This is Thomas Green," the voice said, calm and measured. "I represent Alicia Brown." Rachel's heart hammered. She said nothing. "I'm calling because we received an anonymous tip about possible evidence irregularities," Thomas continued. "If that was you, I want you to know. Coming forward is your choice, but the truth matters here." Rachel stared at the wall. The choice lay bare in front of her. Silence or exposure, safety or consequence. I need time," she whispered. Thomas didn't push. "Take it," he said, "but know this, what you're seeing isn't your burden alone." That night, Rachel didn't sleep at all. By morning, she had made her decision. The day she walked into the courtroom as a newly listed witness, Rachel felt like she was stepping into open air after holding her breath underwater. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back tighter than usual, her hands clasped together to hide their shaking. She looked smaller than the room, but something in her posture had changed, less folded, more deliberate. When her name was called, a murmur rippled through the gallery. Alicia turned and saw her for the first time. Recognition flickered, followed by confusion. Rachel avoided her eyes, focusing straight ahead as she took the stand. Richard Hale frowned, flipping through his notes. He hadn't prepared for this. Rachel's voice trembled at first as she explained her role, her responsibilities, her access. Then she described the footage, the edits, the timestamps, the scanned signature. She spoke slowly, precisely, like someone who knew every word mattered. The courtroom fell quiet. Even Judge Whitman leaned forward. Rachel's fear was still there. It sat heavy in her chest, but it no longer owned her. She finished her testimony with a single sentence that seemed to echo off the walls. "The records don't lie. Someone changed them." Alicia felt her breath catch. For the first time since the trial began, the air shifted. Not toward victory, not yet, but toward possibility. Rachel stepped down from the stand, her knees weak, her future uncertain. She didn't look back. Fear still walked beside her. But the truth was no longer hidden. And for the first time, silence broke. The courtroom felt different that morning. Not louder, not warmer, just altered, as if the air itself had shifted after Rachel Miller stepped down from the stand. People sat straighter. Papers were held a little tighter. Even Judge Whitman, usually impatient with anything that slowed the schedule, lingered over his notes before calling the court back to order. Alicia Brown sat with her hands folded on the table, her posture composed, her face still. She had learned not to trust changes too quickly. Hope, she knew, could be another way to fall. Yet something steady had taken root in her chest. Not relief, not victory, but the quiet sense that the truth had finally entered the room and refused to leave. Thomas Green rose first. His movements were careful, deliberate. He adjusted his glasses and looked toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, we would like to present the original security footage referenced by the previous witness." Richard Hale's head snapped up. His expression, usually smooth and contained, tightened. "Objection," he said quickly. "The footage already reviewed is sufficient." Judge Whitman paused. He glanced toward the jury, then back at Thomas. "On what grounds?" "The footage previously submitted was edited," Thomas replied evenly. "We are requesting the jury be allowed to see the unaltered version." A murmur moved through the courtroom like a ripple across water. Judge Whitman's jaw set. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly as the screen lowered. Alicia felt her pulse quicken, not with fear but with recognition. This was the moment everything she had endured balanced upon. If the footage failed, if it was dismissed, there would be nothing left to explain the months of quiet injustice that had brought her here. The video began. At first, it looked familiar. The warehouse floor, the long stretch of conveyor belts, workers moving in practiced patterns. Then the missing seconds appeared, the part no one had been allowed to see before. The camera angle widened, revealing Daniel Whitmore standing at the approval station. He leaned over the terminal, typed in his credentials, and approved the shipment without completing the required inspection checklist. Minutes later, he walked away. The screen paused. Alicia heard someone inhale sharply behind her. Thomas resumed the video. The timestamp advanced. The footage showed Daniel returning, accessing the system again and navigating through the logs. The screen flickered slightly, then cut to black. Thomas turned to the jury. "That cut," he said calmly, "was the edit." The room was silent. Richard Hale stood abruptly. "This footage has no context," he snapped. "It doesn't prove intent." Thomas nodded. "Then perhaps the internal emails will." A new document appeared on the screen. Emails from senior management filled the display. Subject lines marked urgent. Timestamps clustered tightly together. Alicia recognized none of the names beyond Daniel's, but the tone was unmistakable. Concern over the faulty shipment. Discussion of liability. And then the shift, language that framed Alicia as the solution to a growing problem. One message stood out, projected clearly enough for the jury to read. "Daniel is covered. We cannot afford exposure at his level. Proceed as discussed." Alicia felt the words settle into her bones. Richard Hale's face had lost its color. He shuffled through his papers, his earlier confidence cracking into visible strain. When he spoke again, his voice lacked its usual smoothness. "These emails are being mischaracterized," he said too quickly. "They don't explicitly name—" "They don't need to," Thomas replied. "They show knowledge and choice." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed together. For the first time since the trial began, he said nothing. The jury watched closely now. Faces that had once looked skeptical softened into focus. One juror, an older black man with silver hair and a deeply lined face, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the screen. A younger woman beside him shook her head slowly, as if recalibrating everything she had believed up to that point. Richard Hale attempted to regain control, objecting to tone, to phrasing, to relevance. Each objection came faster than the last. Judge Whitman overruled them with increasing impatience. "Mr. Hale," the judge said sharply, "compose yourself." Daniel Whitmore had been sitting at the defense table throughout, his posture rigid now. Gone was the relaxed confidence. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He did not look at Alicia. Thomas called one final witness, a senior systems auditor who confirmed the authenticity of the recovered footage and emails. The testimony was technical, dry, undeniable. When it was over, the courtroom felt heavy with something like recognition. Not outrage, not triumph. just the collective understanding that a line had been crossed and deliberately hidden. Closing arguments followed, but they felt almost unnecessary. Richard Hale spoke first, his words careful but hollow. He urged the jury to consider complexity, to avoid rushing judgment, to remember corporate processes were imperfect. His voice echoed without landing. Thomas stood last. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He spoke of patterns, of how silence is often mistaken for consent, how systems reward those who know how to hide behind them. He gestured briefly toward Alicia. "She didn't fail this company," he said. "This company failed her, and then taught itself how to blame her for it." The jury retired. The wait stretched. Alicia sat quietly, her hands resting on her knees. Across the room, Sarah Brown sat stiffly, her thin frame folded inward, eyes never leaving her daughter. Years of restraint had carved patience into Sarah's face, but now something else lived there too, vindication edged with grief for how long it had taken. Milo, left at home, slept curled on Alicia's pillow, unaware that the world he knew might soon feel safer. When the jury returned, the room stood. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a steady voice, read the verdict. Liability, wrongful termination, retaliation. Alicia did not move. The words passed through her like light through glass. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. When he spoke, his tone had changed, less dismissive, more measured. "The court finds," he said, "that Ms. Alicia Brown was subjected to an unjust and discriminatory employment action. The evidence demonstrates not individual failure, but a systemic decision to protect authority at the expense of truth." He paused, then added, "This court recognizes Ms. Brown as a victim of workplace injustice." It was not an apology. It was not enough to undo what had been taken. But it was acknowledgment. And in this room, that mattered. Alicia finally exhaled. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment and let the weight lift, not all at once, but enough to stand. Justice had spoken. Not loudly, not cleanly, but clearly. And this time, it had said her name correctly. The ruling settled into the city like a long-awaited rain. Outside the courthouse, Newark moved on. Buses hissed at the curb, horns complained, a street vendor folded his cart. But something had shifted beneath the noise. North River Logistics had lost. Not a procedural loss, not a quiet settlement buried in paperwork, but a verdict spoken aloud and recorded. For Alicia Brown, the words felt unreal at first, like a sound heard underwater. In the days that followed, the consequences arrived one by one. North River's legal team released a brief statement acknowledging the judgment. A second memo followed, longer, careful, drafted by public relations, announcing a commitment to reform. Behind the language, real things happened. The compensation package was finalized. Lost wages restored, damages awarded, legal fees covered. Alicia's employment record was corrected, the termination removed as if it had never existed. She read the letter twice, then set it down and rested her hands on the table, steadying herself. Daniel Whitmore's name appeared in a different context now. An internal investigation expanded into a criminal inquiry. Access logs, emails, and witness statements were forwarded to the prosecutor's office. Daniel, once so certain of his immunity, resigned before the suspension arrived. His photograph surfaced briefly in the local paper, tie loosened, jaw tight, then disappeared from the company website. Alicia did not take satisfaction in it. Accountability was not revenge. It was simply balance. At home, the apartment felt warmer. Sarah Brown moved through the rooms with a lighter step, though her back still pained her and her habits remained cautious. She was a slender woman with a quiet presence, the kind who listened more than she spoke and remembered everything. The verdict did not make her giddy. It made her careful in a new way, hopeful but guarded. She had lived long enough to know how easily progress could be reversed. "I'm proud of you," Sarah said one evening as she folded laundry, her hands practiced, her voice steady. "Not because you won, because you didn't disappear." Alicia nodded, absorbing the words. For years, disappearing had felt like safety. Milo the cat, old and deliberate, had reclaimed his favorite spot on the windowsill. His fur had thinned with age, and his green eyes clouded at the edges, but his loyalty remained exact. He watched the street below with solemn interest, tail flicking once when Alicia passed. He did not know the language of courts or verdicts. He knew only that his person had come home each night, carrying less weight. The calls began soon after. A local reporter requested an interview, then another. Alicia declined at first. She had learned what attention could do, but Thomas Green, her attorney, tired-eyed, earnest, never theatrical, encouraged her to consider it. "Your story won't be yours alone anymore," he said. "That's the point." Alicia agreed to one interview on her terms. She wore a simple navy blouse, hair pulled back, posture composed. She spoke without embellishment. She described the work, the silence, the moment she realized that quiet endurance had been mistaken for consent. She did not name individuals beyond what the record already held. She named systems. The story traveled. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Employees at North River recognized pieces of their own experiences. Some wrote emails they had never planned to send. Others contacted advocacy groups. The company announced policy changes, independent oversight of safety approvals, an external whistleblower channel, mandatory bias audits. Training sessions were scheduled, then rescheduled with broader scope. None of it erased the past. It changed the future's margins. Rachel Miller watched from the edges. She had taken a leave of absence after testifying, the stress leaving her thin and pale. She was still the same careful person, soft-spoken, meticulous, but something in her had hardened into resolve. When she returned to work, she did so with conditions. She accepted a role in a different department, one with direct reporting lines and clearer protections. She did not seek the spotlight. She accepted, quietly, the knowledge that courage had cost her sleep and given her something sturdier in return. They met once, weeks later, at a small cafe near the river. Rachel wore an oversized sweater, sleeves pulled over her hands. Alicia thanked her simply. Rachel nodded, eyes bright but steady. "I was afraid," Rachel said. "I still am." "So was I," Alicia replied. It was enough. Marcus Brown called from campus the night he heard the verdict. He was 21, tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried both optimism and worry. "They talked about it in class," he said, disbelief threading his words. "About the case. About you." Alicia smiled, surprised by the way it felt. "Study," she told him. "That's still the plan." The plan, however, had grown. Invitations arrived from worker advocacy groups, from community centers, from a union hall on the east side where the walls smelled of coffee and old paper. Alicia did not accept all of them. She chose carefully. When she spoke plainly. She did not present herself as fearless. She presented herself as someone who had been afraid and acted anyway. She talked about silence, not as a moral failing, but as a learned survival skill that could be unlearned. She talked about how systems reward quiet until they need a shield. She listened as much as she spoke, recognizing the power in hearing stories without correcting them. At North River, the changes continued. An external monitor was appointed. Reports were reviewed by people whose names Alicia did not know and did not need to know. The warehouse floor looked the same from the outside, but the approvals moved differently now. Paper trails lengthened. Shortcuts narrowed. One afternoon, Alicia returned to the courthouse, not for a hearing but to retrieve copies of the final order. The building felt less imposing. Or perhaps she felt more anchored. As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the sky opened into a clean blue, the kind that followed a storm. She did not believe the world had become fair. She believed it had become answerable. That night at home, Sarah brewed tea and set 2 cups on the table. Milo slept between them, chin tucked, breathing slow. The apartment hummed with ordinary sounds. Alicia looked around and recognized the quiet, not the silence that erased her, but the calm that followed being heard. She had not planned to become a voice. She had planned to survive. The difference, she now understood, was choice. And this time, the truth did not demand more than she could give. It gave her peace. Ultimately, the lesson isn't about winning the case. It's about understanding the silent choices we make every day. Many people are silent at work, at home, or in their communities not because they agree, but because they're trying to survive. Silence can bring a sense of security. It can bring a sense of peace. But this story reminds us that when silence doesn't bring the peace we desire, we need to let the world know that we need to end injustice with the strength that's often hidden. In everyday life, injustice will always exist, whether loudly or quietly. Sometimes it manifests itself in small moments. The courage Alicia found wasn't initially loud. It began the moment she chose the truth instead of accepting it. And when a voice is raised, it allows others to breathe, to speak, and to stand up. If this story moves you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that their voice matters. Leave a comment and let us know where you've been watching since today, or share a moment when you chose to speak up or remain silent. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of justice, faith, and courage can reach those who feel alone. And to all of you watching, may God protect you in your work, strengthen you when you are weary, and guide you when fear tries to silence your voice. If you believe that truth still matters and justice is never forgotten by God, write Amen in the comments.